Thank you very much for the introduction. Let me get organized here. There we go. Is what I'd like to do in this paper is to make two antagonistic points. First, I want to argue that Karl von Clausewitz's most significant insight is that war cannot be defined by a single definition. At least two are required. Second, I want to argue that both of his definitions are inadequate and misleading, especially his second, policy by other means. Policy by other means is especially misleading because it fails to make clear that which warriors actually do when they wage war. The primary consequence of these 2 points is that Clausewitz's definitions of war do not form a solid foundation for military ethics. As is well known, the Greeks, unlike the Romans, deified the two faces of war with two different gods, Athena and her half-brother Ares. Ares, man's bane, the bloody stormer of cities, that madden, born-a-villain turncoat god, was the savage god of ruthless and purposeless battle. In contrast, bright-eyed Athena, child of aegis-bearing Zeus, was the first virgin goddess of wisdom and discipline, purposeful warfare. Appropriating Greek mythology for present purposes, I believe that the insensate Ares represents Clausewitz's first definition of war as thus the active force to compel our enemy to do our will. In contrast, wise Athena represents Clausewitz's especially troubling second definition of war as policy by other means. In sum, both definitions are unclear and indistinct because they are uncoordinated. They do not mutually support each other. In particular, Clausewitz's policy by other means is too vague and too ambiguous to counterbalance and illuminate his active force to compel our enemy to do our will. More precisely, Clausewitz's first definition does an excellent job of defining war as a perceived phenomenon. His first definition answers the epistemological question, how does one perceive war? It answers the epistemological question, what is the intersubjective reaction of observant perceiver to seeing armed warfare happening in the world? What an observant perceiver sees is violence. He sees the killing of people and the busting of things. He sees that war is thus an active force to compel our enemy to do our will. He sees that war is an observed and perceived phenomenon. However, the excellence of Clausewitz's epistemological definition of war is immediately undercut by his second definition. Undercut because policy by other means does not answer the contrasting ontological question, how does war come into existence? This ontological question is critical because war must exist before an observant perceiver can perceive it as a phenomenon. In other words, ontology precedes epistemology. Hence, the immediate purpose of this paper is to develop an ontological definition of war that is very much clearer and more distinct than Clausewitz's fatally flawed policy by other means. To this end, the rest of the presentation is in 3 parts. It begins with the amoral epistemological definition of war as thus an active force to compel our enemy to do our will, and then searches for a solid ontological definition to replace policy by other means. To repeat, the central point of Clausewitz's first definition is that it does define war, but it does not define war ontologically. It does not define war as an occurrence in space and time on the ground. Rather, Clausewitz's first definition defines war epistemologically as a phenomenon, as war is perceived intersubjectively. But a perceived intersubjectivity does not exist in the material world as a fact on the ground. Instead, it exists as a mental object in the mind of the perceiver. To verify this point, can anyone give me a good definition of rape? Can anyone give me a good definition of robbery? Can anyone give me a good definition of fraud? Can anyone give me a good definition of assault? The issue, of course, is that a good definition defines one and only one word. That is, technically, a good definiendum defines one and only one definiens. In effect, then, Clausewitz's first definition recognizes the fact that war itself is perceived as belonging to a large class of intersubjective phenomenon that are perceived as being violent, that are perceived as being the killing of people and the busting of things, that are perceived as being an active force to compel our enemy to do our will. As such, Clausewitz's first definition does define war epistemologically, as it is perceived by humans. But it does not define war ontologically. It does not define war as waged by warriors. It does not define war as an existing material fact on the ground. Clausewitz's epistemological definition, therefore, possesses no ethical value for three reasons. First, perceptions are only perceptions. They exist not in the material world, but at one removed in a socially constructed intersubjective reality as mental objects. Ethics, and especially military ethics, exist in the material world, on the ground, and not in the intersubjective world, not in a world of perceived phenomenon. Second, instead of raising ethical questions, what Clausewitz's epistemological definition actually does is to classify war not as a material fact on the ground, but instead as a member of the large perceptual class, a large class of violent phenomenon. Third, ethics does not consist of active force to compel our enemy to do our will. As John Mill has observed, it is little justifiable to force our ideas on other people as to compel them to submit to our will in any other way. Moving on to the second part of this paper, consider next Clausewitz's ontological definition, policy by other means. To do this, one must investigate both the necessary and the sufficient conditions for the coming into existence of war. The initial observation of the Clausewitz's dictum that war is policy by other means is impossibly vague and ambiguous. Neither Conrad Dudens nor Noah Webster nor John Murray would have accepted such a vague definition into their dictionaries. The next observation is that if war be policy, then that policy must be declared, preferably in an open and determined declaration of war. An open and determined declaration of war discharges two main functions. First, it does, or at least it should, define the political purposes of the war and authorize the initiation of armed hostilities. This authorizing function is most clearly described by John Austin as the intentional armature that motivates performative speech acts. That is, a war comes into existence after, and only after, the utterance of an open and determined declaration of war and follow-on military orders. Why are performative speech acts crucial to the coming into existence of war? As every PFC knows, the brutal fact of the matter is that nothing happens without a performative speech act. Nothing happens without an order from a competent authority. Without an order from a competent authority, no PFC, no general will do anything. No PFC, no general will move without an order from a competent authority. Hence, no war can possibly come into existence without a declarative speech act and follow-on military orders. Consequently, the absolutely necessary ontological condition for the coming into existence of war is the utterance of an open and determined declaration of war. This absolutely necessary condition, therefore, constitutes the initial part of the ontological definition of war. That is, the necessary condition for real war, as Clausewitz called it, is not some vague and ambiguous policy. Rather, real war comes into existence with a declarative speech act that authorizes some as yet unarticulated means. What then are the unarticulated means? What are the sufficient conditions for the coming into existence of war as a material fact on the ground? Identifying the sufficient conditions for war requires one to acknowledge that Clausewitz's by other means is just as vague and ambiguous as his term policy. Furthermore, combining Clausewitz's two definitions into one only creates vicious circularity. After all, to say that war is policy by means of an act of force to compel our enemy to do our will is only to compound the confusion. It is an attempt to define an utterly vague and ambiguous term by saying that war belongs to the same large class of violent phenomena as rape, fraud, robbery, assault, and so on. But critically, this vicious circularity does not describe what warriors do when they wage war. What, therefore, do warriors actually do when they wage war? Needless to say, what warriors do when they wage war is to locate, close with, and destroy the enemy by fire and maneuver, or repel the enemy's assault by fire and close combat. The mission of the infantry riflery squad not only describes, but it also defines the sufficient but not necessary condition for the coming into existence of armed warfare as a material fact on the ground. Ontologically, then, real war is a declarative speech act that authorizes the maneuvering of armed or unarmed men and machines over terrain on order in accordance with the laws and customs of war. With this ontological definition in hand, one is now in a position to address questions of both military ethics and the just war criteria. First, one can ask whether the Declarative Speech Act meets the ad bellum criteria, most especially the open and determined criteria. Second, one is also in a position to question whether the maneuvers employed meet the in bello criteria, whether the maneuvers were not only competently authorized, but executed within the boundaries of the laws and customs of war. So those are the 2 points I want to make, and thank you very much for listening. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.